In this segment, we're going to take a look at what happened as the world went to war and erupted again. We often associate World War II with four faces of aggression. We think of Benito Mussolini, who has established fascist Italy. We think of Adolf Hitler, who established Nazi Germany. We think of Hideki Tojo, the prime minister who was an imperialist in Japan, and Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator of the Soviet Union. While each of these rose to power in different places, they pretty much followed the same common themes, including holding power by force and fear. Each of these dictators forbid political competition. They appealed to their nation's pride and prejudices. And each nation was suffering hard economic times at the end of World War I and wanted to grow out of their own global depressions. As we watch this slide, we want to consider how did the United States respond to the increasing totalitarian aggression in Europe and in Asia as World War II began, and also what caused America's gradual abandonment of the policy of neutrality. America attempted neutrality as militarism was sweeping across Europe. As you can see in this Dr. Seuss cartoon, where the old family bathtub is plenty safe for me, Seuss is making a comment that while we here in America think we are safe in the American or Western Hemisphere, the bathtub is full of aggressors. America responded to increasing tensions with the Neutrality Acts of 1935, where we declared it would be illegal for the United States to assist any belligerent nation. America First became the catchphrase of the time. That is, let's look out for America first. After all, this is the 1930s. We have problems of our own. The war began in September of 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. At the same time, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the opposite end. Now, we knew that the Nazis and the communists were staunch enemies. However, as those armies came to meet, they stopped. They would not engage in each other. Well, later we came to find out that Hitler and Stalin had signed this thing called the Non-Aggression Pact. Before the war even broke out, they had secretly met and decided that they would not square off and fight each other. Hitler had bigger plans. He knew that eventually he wanted to take on Joseph Stalin. Stalin was no idiot. He knew that eventually Hitler wanted a piece of him, but Stalin was not quite ready for war. And so therefore, as Hitler moves in, Stalin moves into Poland and establishes the buffer zone and buys time. Well, as soon as Germany invaded Poland, even though the Nazis had made transgression after transgression against the Treaty of Versailles, this was ultimately the last straw. France and Great Britain quickly declared war on Germany. Well, Germany in turn declared war on France and Great Britain, which brought Italy into the conflict, and then France and Great Britain declared war on Italy as well. And then a bunch of other guys jumped in. Hey, we're back to another world war. But it seemed like nothing was happening. As the months moved on, Hitler went into action. The United States held on to the idea that we are going to stay neutral and stay as neutral as we possibly can. Germany quickly overran France, Belgium, and many other states and countries in Europe. Germany pounded Great Britain from the air in what came to be known as the Great Battle of Britain, where bombardment after bombardment occurred in cities all across Great Britain. It seemed that the British didn't stand a chance, alone on an island, and France had already given in and surrendered. Well, Britain pretty much stood alone against the Nazi force. But it was amazing the resilience of the British people who found refuge in the sewers, but more importantly, the subways across London. And they managed to hang on and survive. By mid-1941, Hitler became very frustrated. He was not strangling Britain like he had hoped, and they were not conceding to his air raids. In fact, Hitler was losing quite a few bombers during this time. And that's when Hitler decided to move his plan ahead anyway. And by mid-1941, Hitler turned on what seemed to be his former partner. He invades the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, America is still debating. Should we get involved? Shouldn't we get involved? We got involved before, but is now the right time? After all, we still have this Great Depression going on. The United States slowly, again like World War I, slowly abandoned neutrality as events in Europe and Asia pulled us into war. When it comes to the war in Europe, despite the strong isolationist sentiment here at home, the United States increasingly began to help Britain. We gave Britain war supplies, old naval ships, in return for naval bases in Bermuda and the Caribbean. It was what we called the Lend-Lease Act. We will loan you something in exchange, and we offered this. But slowly, the Lend-Lease Act gave the president the authority to sell or lend equipment to countries to defend themselves against the Axis aggressors, with payment to be made later on. Franklin Roosevelt compared this to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. In a fireside chat, Roosevelt explained that if you hear a knock on the door in the middle of the night and it's your neighbor who needs a hose to put out the fire, you don't ask him for payment right then. You don't ask, how is this going to be returned to me? How long can I expect it to be borrowed? What if the hose is damaged? You help your neighbor. And in this case, Roosevelt said, we need to help Great Britain. And while most Americans were focused on the events that were going on in Europe and arguing back and forth, should we loan stuff? Should we stay with cash and carry? What should we do? It was really going to be the war in Asia that draws us directly into this conflict. The war in Asia had been going on for quite a while. The militaristic Japan had invaded and brutalized Manchuria in the early 1930s. It also invaded and brutalized China as it sought military and economic domination over Asia. The United States refused to recognize these gains. We declared that they were simply not right, that Japan had no business being an aggressor nation. We even embargoed our exports to Japan, our scrap metal, our iron, steel, and oil. We said, we're going to cut you off until you get out of those areas and play nice. Every time Japan seemed to refuse, we would negotiate. And time after time after time, for 5 or 6 years, we always seemed to find a way to find peace. However, all of that changes on December 7th, 1941. In the midst of negotiating with us, and without any warning whatsoever, Japan carried out an air attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, again, December 7th, 1941. The surprise attack was incredibly successful. It destroyed most of the American Pacific Fleet, killed several thousand Americans, and was the deadliest attack on American soil until September 11th. Isolation was never going to happen again. On December 8th, 1941, the Monday following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the president called a special session of Congress. Roosevelt declared the attack on Pearl Harbor a date that will live in infamy, and he asked Congress to declare war on Japan, which they did resoundingly. As Dr. Seuss points out, this is the end of a nap. The United States is now awakened from its isolationist slumber. Now, when it came to World War II, we are going to be in it. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler honored a pact with Japan and declared war on the United States. The debate over isolationism in the United States were over. World War II was now a true world war, and the United States was fully involved. In this segment, we're going to take a look at America's role in the war between 1941 and 1945. Some questions that we want to answer. What was the overall strategy of America and its allies in World War II? How did America's strategy during World War II reflect available resources and the geographical scope of the conflict? And why were some of the battles in World War II considered turning points during that war? Let's take a look at some of our World War II leaders. The big three, as you see above me, include, from left to right, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. That's Franklin Roosevelt from the United States. Yay! And Winston Churchill from Great Britain. Yay! But the bad guys, oops, over there, include, on the left, Benito Mussolini, fascist dictator of Italy, and Adolf Hitler, Nazi fascist leader and dictator of Germany. We need to understand that the wartime strategies reflect the political and military goals of the alliances. It includes the resources that they had on hand, and again, the geographical extent of this conflict. When we take a look at the Allied strategy across Europe, American forces were joined by Great Britain and the Soviet Union. After it was invaded by Germany, they adopted a policy of defeat Hitler first. Even though it was Japan that attacked us, we knew that the first emergency needed to be dealt with, and that was Adolf Hitler. So most of American military resources were initially targeted for Europe, and then later we would move those. When it came to the Axis strategy in Europe, Germany had hoped to defeat the Soviet Union very quickly, to gain access to its oil fields in which to then utilize as part of its war machine and blitzkrieg the rest of Europe. They wanted to force Britain out of the war through a long bombing campaign and a campaign of submarine warfare to isolate Britain as an island and essentially put it under siege. And they wanted to do this before America could get involved and turn our industrial and military strength on them and turn the tide as we did in World War I. As we take a look at some of the major battles and turning points of this war, there were a lot of battles, and we could go on for an entire semester talking about them all. But we want to focus on three major turning points here in Europe. The first one happened, well, in Africa, at the Battle of El Alamein. German forces were threatening to seize the Suez Canal in Egypt, and they were held off by the British. This defeat prevented Hitler from gaining access to the oil fields in the Middle East, and it also prevents him from attacking Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union from the south. With a defeat at this point, the British pushed west across Africa. Meanwhile, Americans joined in the fight and joined up with the British and attacked Italy here from the south. Another major turning point, this time on the Eastern Front, happened at a place called Stalingrad. Yes, the city that was named after the communist dictator of the Soviet Union. Stalingrad lasted several months. It was a months-long siege. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in this long siege of the Russian city, in which Joseph Stalin gave the order, "We don't surrender here. This is our last stand." And they were willing to fight to the very last man. Unfortunately for the Nazis, this battle raged on and on and on. They ran quickly out of ammunition. They ran out of supplies. They were ill-equipped to handle the brutally cold Russian winter, and they were forced into submission. At that point of time, the Red Army of Joseph Stalin began to rapidly push back against Germany. The turning point for America came at D-Day, or Normandy, France, when British and American forces launched an all-out invasion to liberate France from Nazi control. Remember, France had surrendered after just a few weeks of fighting against the Nazis. And we needed a beachhead. We needed a secure location with which we could launch a counteroffensive against Germany. Now, Joseph Stalin had been bearing the brunt of this war for the first several years of World War II. And now, with us attacking on Hitler's Western Front, his forces needed to be divided. And they were already pretty ripped up at the exploits of the Red Army. And as we invaded here, gained a foothold at the cost of thousands of American lives and much, much hardship, American, British, and now the French forces, who were left over, joined in, pushed back against Germany. And that's going to lead to German defeat. Victory in Europe, or VE Day, came on May 8th, 1945. Hitler had committed suicide and left Germany essentially alone without leadership. And those who were left in relative charge of a destroyed army agreed they simply needed to surrender. But the war's not over. Still, on May 8th, 1945, America has a very powerful enemy in Japan. And so now it's time for us to focus our entire attention on defeating the Empire of Japan. When it came to the Allied strategy in Asia, in the Pacific, the American military strategy called for an island-hopping campaign. That is, seizing islands closer and closer to Japan and using them as bases for air attacks on Japan and cutting off Japanese supplies through submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. The Axis strategy in Asia was after Pearl Harbor. Again, a lot of this hinged on their success in Pearl Harbor. Japan wanted to invade the Philippines, which they did, and won. Indonesia, and then they planned to invade both Australia and Hawaii. The leaders in Japan hoped that America would then accept Japanese predominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And rather than conduct a bloody and costly war to reverse Japanese gains, we would simply go, you win, you've got this territory. Japan did not want to attack the American mainland, but they did want a dominant empire in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. When it comes to the major battles and turning points in the Pacific Ocean, things were much different here than they were in Europe. The major turning point, or I should say the first turning point, happened at the Battle of Midway. In the Miracle of Midway, American naval forces defeated a much larger Japanese force as it prepared to seize Midway Island. Coming only a few months after Pearl Harbor, this was America's first major victory. What this does is this stops Japanese aggression. This is as far as the Japanese got. It was almost a surprise victory, thus we call it the Miracle of Midway. And this begins our active carrying out strategy. This starts our island hopping. As American forces move further west across the Pacific, retake places like Guam and the Philippines, and get closer and closer to Japan. But we're not close enough. Two very important battles happened at Iwo Jima, right here, shortly followed by Okinawa, right here. These two battles cost America thousands and thousands of lives, but it brought us closer and closer to Japan. The Japanese fought more and more ferociously the closer that we got to the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, because they knew that from these two islands, America could launch direct air attacks on the mainland and potentially launch a land invasion. The Japanese soldiers, as I said, fought fiercely and over every single square inch. They were deeply entrenched, which is why we have so many American casualties during this time and why these battles lasted for months rather than simply days. Japanese soldiers and civilians would rather commit suicide than surrender, and so the fighting was extremely ferocious. But once we won Iwo Jima and Okinawa, we were now close enough to launch air attacks, and we had a secret weapon. Boom. The Pacific battles came to an end when the United States decided to use the atomic bomb. Facing the prospect of horrendous casualties among Americans as well as the Japanese if the American forces invaded Japan itself, President Harry Truman made a very important decision. He ordered the use of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He felt that only this massive show of force would give the Japanese leadership reason to surrender. These guys were willing to fight to their very deaths and to the deaths of all of their citizens. If we could show enough force that we could quickly end the war with these atomic bombs, perhaps we could save more lives. However, we need to note that tens of thousands of people were killed in both of these cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And while they were both military targets, many civilians were incinerated with these devices. But it was this show of force that finally brought Japan to the table where they accepted surrender and offered that to the United States. Now the war is going to be over. So why did Truman drop the bomb? Obviously, we know that this is going to shorten the war. This is going to save American lives, even save Japanese lives in the case of an invasion. While tens of thousands of people have died during this bombing, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, could have died during a land invasion. But Truman also had other reasons. He also wanted to show off a little bit. He needed to show off his power to the Soviet Union. Even though they were our ally against Hitler and Mussolini, the Soviet Union had not declared war yet against Japan. They had planned to do this 6 months after Hitler's surrender. If we can drop the bomb on Japan first, force them to surrender without the Soviet Union's help, we could prove to them that we don't need them in the future, that we have the strength and we have the power. And we also come to realize that the Soviet Union is likely to be our next arch enemy. And besides, the Manhattan Project, which secretly built this bomb, cost gazillions of dollars. I don't know the exact number. And what good is having a weapon that you're going to spend billions on if you don't use it?